Okay, so you know how sometimes you really want to grasp what's going on beneath the surface, to understand these complex world events, get those big ideas, but without feeling like you need uh, a doctorate just to keep up.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's what we're doing here. Today, we're going to dive deep into a really important piece. Judith Butler's chapter, Precarious Life. It's from her book with the same title.
And it's so powerful because Butler wrote it right after 9/11. It really makes us confront some, let's say, uncomfortable truths about being vulnerable, about violence, and, what we owe each other globally.
Heavy stuff, for sure.
Definitely. But it gives us these crucial tools for understanding how we see the world, even today.
Right. So our mission here is to unpack Butler's main arguments. We want to get clear on key ideas like precarity and grievability, look at the whole political climate she was writing in, and maybe even touch on some criticisms.
Think of it as your shortcut, basically.
Your shortcut to understanding precarious life and why it still matters so much. Okay, so where does she kick things off?
Well, she starts right there, in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, looking at how the whole national conversation unfolded.
Great.
And beyond the grief and solidarity, which was understandable, of course, Butler points out this worrying trend, this growing kind of skepticism towards intellectual questions and less space for dissenting views in the media.
Oh, right. It felt like if you even tried to ask why, like try to understand the factors behind it all, you were immediately painted as, what, making excuses for terrorism?
Exactly that. There was this intense pressure to just stick to the main story. And Butler highlights that New York Times term, excusenicks. That was a really potent example, wasn't it?
It really was.
It just lumped anyone questioning the official line together with, historical dissenters like peaceniks or refuseniks. The message is pretty clear. Thinking critically right then felt like a betrayal.
And Butler makes such a critical point there. Wanting to understand context isn't the same as justifying the violence. You can be horrified, absolutely horrified, but still think it's vital to analyze the history, the politics.
That drive to understand shouldn't be shut down. But
Yeah.
instead, what we saw was this really rigid binary. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists.
Yeah.
And that kind of black and white thinking just made it almost impossible to hold a more complex view, right? To condemn the attacks and question the response. What strikes you about that?
For me, it's just how fast that binary locked in.
Yeah.
And how effectively it, killed any deeper discussion. It also seemed to feed this return to really simplistic East versus West narratives,
Oh, definitely.
where Islam suddenly became this single barbaric thing opposing civilization.
Right. And then when voices, often from the left, tried to offer some analysis, tried to tackle that big question, why do they hate us? Their ideas were just shot down as apologetics.
Immediately.
And Butler argues that by shutting down talk about, say, U.S. foreign policy's role, we actually stop ourselves from understanding the conditions that might make terrorism possible in the first place.
And you could really see how marginalized critical voices became in the mainstream media then. People like Arundhati Roy or Noam Chomsky.
Sidelined.
Yeah, pretty much sidelined if they offered perspectives critical of U.S. actions globally.
And this wasn't just talk, was it? This suppression of dissent happened alongside real political moves, suspending civil liberties for some groups, the flag becoming this almost sacred symbol you couldn't question.
Right, a symbol of unity, but also of support for military action.
Exactly.
So this is where it gets really interesting, I think. Butler shifts focus to how the story of violence after 9/11 got told, how it centered so intensely on the U.S. as the only victim. And she argues that this specific framing actually stopped us from looking at the deeper history.
Yeah, the focus zooms right in on individual bad guys, Muhammad Atta, Osama bin Laden, which, gives you a seemingly simple story about individual blame. Right.
But it also conveniently hides any broader factors, systemic things, political contexts that might be relevant. It's fascinating how that individual focus shapes everything, isn't it?
It's such a contrast when you compare it to how the U.S. military response was covered. You rarely saw graphic images of the violence the U.S. was inflicting.
Very little.
And it was almost always framed as necessary self-defense, even noble.
Precisely. Butler's point is that by starting and ending the story with the American experience of being attacked, we lock ourselves into this first-person viewpoint. We resist what she calls decentering.
Meaning stepping outside our own perspective.
Yeah, to see the bigger global picture and our place, our actions within it.
And she links this reluctance to see beyond ourselves directly to the U.S. preference for unilateralism acting alone, basically.
Going it alone rather than working through international bodies or coalitions. Which leads her to ask this really important question, something for you, the listener, to think about. Could there be another way to understand this decentering? Can moving beyond just the U.S. story mean something different?
She suggests that if we're open to different explanations, even the uncomfortable ones that challenge our beliefs,
Yeah.
it could actually open up a path to a different kind of ethical responsibility on the world stage.
But there's that fear, isn't there?
Yeah.
That if you try to understand an opposing view, you're somehow condoning it, like you'll get morally contaminated.
Right, that's a common fear. But Butler really questions that assumption.
And she asks, does just finding and punishing the individuals involved really fix the root problem? Or could U.S. actions themselves, like invading Iraq or supporting certain regimes, actually end up fueling anti-American feelings?
Which brings her to the whole just war debate. She looks at how some liberals, even while supporting the war effort, kind of unintentionally helped frame U.S. state violence as something totally different from terrorism.
Because they also didn't want to be called excusenicks.
Exactly. And linking this back, you see how even arguments made with good intentions can sometimes reinforce problematic frameworks.
But her argument fundamentally is that trying to understand how a situation developed historically isn't about letting perpetrators off the hook.
Not at all.
It's about getting a fuller picture, a more comprehensive understanding of all the tangled factors involved.
She also critiques some on the left who just said the U.S. reaped what it sowed. Well, that sounds critical.
Yep.
Butler suggests it can be another way of keeping the U.S. at the center, assuming its actions are the only thing that determines what happens globally. Kind of another form of U.S. omnipotence.
Interesting. And she addresses those conspiracy theories, too. Mossad involvement, dismissing them, but still pointing out actual historical links, like bin Laden's past CIA connections or U.S. support for the Taliban.
Right. Acknowledging those connections is just part of the factual history, even if they don't offer some simple, grand explanation.
So the key distinction she keeps coming back to is blaming the victim is wrong, generally unacceptable, but asking about the U.S. role in the wider world, that's a totally different kind of question.
A different kind of inquiry altogether, which does raise that tricky question. Where is the line between understanding context and just assigning blame everywhere?
And this leads right into the difference between conditions and causes. This is important. She mentions Arroyo talking about poverty as a breeding ground, and Arundhati Roy's metaphor of the U.S. as the targeted spare rib.
These aren't saying poverty caused 9/11 or U.S. policy caused it directly. They're identifying conditions necessary or contributing factors that make terrorism more likely.
So conditions don't act on their own.
No, they're the background, the context within which people make choices and act.
So Butler suggests U.S. imperialism wasn't the direct cause of 9/11, but it could be seen as a major condition. The larger environment.
And to really get that, you have to try and understand how U.S. power is experienced by people affected by it, how it shapes their reality and their sense of agency.
Mary Kaldor's point about young men in war zones lacking opportunities, making extremist groups seem appealing, that's another example of the condition.
Exactly. And then Butler asks this really stark, unsettling question. Are all lives actually valued equally in our world?
She contrasts the huge media focus and public mourning for American 9/11 victims with the, frankly, minimal attention given to the hundreds of thousands of Iraqi deaths after the invasion.
Asking, essentially, are Muslim lives seen as equally grievable? That's her term. Are they seen as equally worthy of mourning as, quote, legibly first world lives?
And that's the concept of grievability, right? Whose lives get recognized, whose deaths register politically, whose loss counts as a loss worth mourning publicly.
Exactly. Butler argues this unequal distribution of grievability is fundamental to how we understand who counts as fully human. It seems abstract, but you see its real-world effects constantly.
She uses that incident between Mayor Giuliani and the Saudi prince, Al-Walid bin Talal, as a case study.
Right after 9/11.
The prince offered a big donation, $10 million, I think.
Yeah, substantial.
But he also made comments suggesting the U.S. should look at his policies, especially regarding Palestinians, mentioning they were being slaughtered.
And Giuliani famously gave the check back.
Yeah, saying there was no moral equivalent to the 9/11 attacks. He basically took the prince's comment as equating the two, or even justifying 9/11.
And Butler digs into why those two ideas, condemning 9/11 and acknowledging Palestinian suffering, were seen as completely incompatible in that moment.
Why?
She suggests the word slaughter itself is often, maybe unconsciously, reserved for violence against powerful Western nations.
Ah, I see. So the implication was if you call Palestinian deaths slaughter, you're somehow equating them morally with the 9/11 deaths.
That seemed to be Giuliani's interpretation, yeah. But Butler argues that refusing to recognize Palestinian suffering in those strong terms actually fuels anger and blocks any real understanding between different experiences of violence.
So her point isn't about blaming the U.S. for 9/11 or excusing the attackers.
No, it's about saying that understanding the U.S. role in the world, its impact, requires a different kind of responsibility, a responsibility to work towards more just and equal global conditions.
She then circles back to the criticism Arundhati Roy faced. How Roy's critique of U.S. imperialism was just labeled anti-U.S.
Yeah, another example of shutting down dissent.
It shows how condemning violence and trying to understand its origins often get presented as opposites, right?
When really, Butler argues they're both crucial.
Yeah.
Distinct, but both necessary for any real understanding. Our public conversation struggles with that kind of dual thinking.
She then comes back to individual versus collective responsibility. The people who commit violence are responsible for their actions, obviously.
Absolutely.
But they're also products of the world they live in, the collective conditions.
Butler critiques focusing only on individual morality, which ignores the whole context where choices get made. She pushes us to ask, how does radical violence even become a thinkable option for some people? Under what conditions? In response to what kinds of injustice or violation?
And asking these questions isn't about making excuses.
No, it's about rethinking the link between the conditions we collectively create and the acts that happen within them.
In fact, Butler argues that our ethical responsibility actually gets stronger after we ourselves experience violence.
How so?
It forces an ethical choice. How will we respond? Will we just lash out and continue the cycle? Or will we reflect and try to break it?
Okay. Which leads to her ideas about the path forward, beyond just revenge.
Yeah. She argues for basically two tracks. Pursuing accountability for perpetrators, ideally through international law,
Okay.
and at the same time, taking collective responsibility for creating more just global conditions.
She's critical of purely military solutions, right?
Very. She suggests they often backfire, creating more resentment, more recruits for extremist groups. She even invokes the ancient Greek playwright Aeschylus
Oh, interesting.
about the need to break the cycle of revenge to achieve real justice.
So the core message is,
Ultimately, Butler says collective responsibility means we have to listen differently, be open to perspectives outside our usual frame, narratives that maybe challenge U.S. dominance.
understanding the history, even the uncomfortable parts, doesn't excuse violence.
But it's absolutely essential if we want to prevent it from happening again.
So wrapping up this deep dive into Judith Butler's Precarious Life chapter, we've really tried to cover her main points about our shared vulnerability, how mourning is often selective, and that ethical need to understand the conditions that breed violence.
Yeah, we looked at key terms like precarity, grievability, the post-9/11 context, that Giuliani example, and some critiques too.
Our goal was really to give you a clear, solid understanding of these complex but incredibly relevant ideas and what they mean in the real world. Sort of a shortcut to grasping Butler's critical thinking here.
So now that we've unpacked all this, maybe a final thought for you to consider. How does this change how you look at current global conflicts or events?
And what does recognizing the precarity of all life mean for our own responsibilities, our political responses to suffering?
That covers the entire chapter from Judith Butler's Precarious Life, exploring all the key arguments, terms, context, examples, and critiques.